Hello and welcome. In today's video I'm going to be showing you how to finish off the quilt that we started last week. So last week, if you haven't already seen it, I pieced together all of the squares and now I'm ready to add the backing. So we've got backing fabric, and we're also going to put a binding on. So let's get started. Cut a piece of backing fabric 4 inches longer and 4 inches wider than your quilt measures, and do the same with a piece of batting. So once you've got your backing fabric levelled out, you can tape it to the table if you want to make sure it stays nice and flat with no creases. And put your batting on top and then lay your quilt over the batting and level them all up. There should be 2 inches spare batting and backing fabric all the way around. When you're satisfied that all your 3 layers of fabric are nice and level, then you can pin in the centre of each of your squares to hold it all together while you quilt. Start pinning at the centre of your quilt and gradually work your way out to the sides. Keep going until you have a pin in every square, and then you're done and you're ready to start quilting your quilt. And now you're ready to start the quilting process. So to do this, I've put my walking foot on and I've threaded my sewing machine up with some pale blue thread to match both the front and the back of this quilt, because it's nearly all blue. So blue for this, or pale blue, is the best colour. And I'm sewing, well, I'm starting down the centre and I'm sewing 1/4 of an inch away from the centre seam as I go down, and when I get to the bottom I'll turn around and come back up 1/4 of an inch to the other side of the centre seam, if that makes any sense. So we sew all the way down one side, turn around and come back up the other side, and on both sides we're sewing 1/4 of an inch away from that centre seam. Continue to sew up and down all of the columns until you've finished them all. So you should have a row of stitching to the side of the centre seam on each of your columns. When you've sewn down all of the column seams, you can turn around and start sewing from the side. So you're going to sew across the rows this time, and we're going to do exactly the same thing, 1/4 of an inch from that seam on each side. So we sew down one side, when we get to the end we turn around, come back again. When we've finished sewing up and down all of the seams, we can then remove all of the safety pins because we don't need them anymore. Once all of your pins, safety pins, have been removed, it's time to trim down your quilt. So I start by doing one side, straighten one edge off, and then I turn my quilt, and then with my long quilter's ruler I match the edge at the bottom with my quilt to make sure that I get a nice square edge, and then I cut the next side and I continue squaring off until I've done all 4 sides, making sure that they're as square as I can get them without taking too much of my patchwork squares off, but you may have to take a little bit off just to level it out. Next, cut strips of binding tape. I'm going to cut mine 2.5 inches wide, and this fabric is 44 inches long. I fold it in half and cut 3 strips, which should be just long enough to go all the way around the edge of this very small quilt. To join the binding, place 2 pieces of binding at right angles with right sides together, then draw a 45-degree angle from the top left hand corner of the first piece down to the bottom right hand corner of the bottom piece. Most quilters' rulers do have the 45-degree angle marked, so I use that to guide me, and then pin together and sew along the line that you drew, and repeat the same process to join your 3rd piece of binding. After you've pressed open your seams from your joins, fold your binding tape in half and pin or clip from the centre of one side, leaving a good tail end and pinning down to the bottom corner. Then make a mark 1/4 of an inch from the end of your quilt. I'm using a friction pen so it will iron out later, and then I transfer this mark to my binding, and this is the mark that I will sew to. I forgot to film this next bit, so you'll see I'm actually sewing over my original sewing. So taking 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, sew from the middle of your quilt on one side down to the mark that you left at the bottom. When you get to this mark, you can either back tack or finish at the mark with your needle down, lift your presser foot and turn and go off to the corner at an angle. It's entirely up to you which method you use. To make the mitered corners, I make sure that my quilt is nice and square on my cutting mat, so I line it up with the lines on my cutting mat and fold my binding tape at a 45-degree angle and then fold it back over itself, making sure that the top and the sides are matched up nice and level. Then clip or pin in place. Then sew down the next side, starting at the top corner and taking 1/4 inch seam allowance. Sew down to the next corner, and at the sewing machine here I just mark my 1/4 inch from the edge. Then continue sewing down to your mark and again go off to the corner. And on this one I'm going to fold my mitered corner at the sewing machine. So I fold my 45-degree angle and then fold the fabric back over, leveling it off with the top, pin in place, and then start sewing from the top corner all the way down to 1/4 inch from the bottom. And continue using this method until you've done all 4 corners and stopping about 12 inches away from where you started, leaving plenty of space to join the 2 pieces of binding together. Then make a mark on the right hand side of your binding at around the centre mark, and then make another mark about 1/4 inch past this. This is to allow for our seam allowance. And then cut along your second mark that you made, and then take your left hand side binding and place it over the right hand side and do it quite tight. You don't want to do it loosely, do it tight, and make a mark where the right side joins the left side. And then we're going to put another mark 2.5 inches past this. This is to allow for the join, and then cut along this line. Next, take the right hand side binding and open it out and place it wrong side down on your quilt, and then take the left hand side and place that on top with the right side facing the right side of the right side binding, and then pin in place. I've made things a little bit difficult for myself here because I haven't quite left a big enough opening. 12 inches is a good idea. Next, draw your line at a 45-degree angle to sew on. I'm using a friction pen so I can rub it out or at least iron it off later. And then at your sewing machine, sew across the line that you have just drawn, back tacking at the start and the finish. Trim the seam and then press it open, and then clip or pin in place before sewing at your sewing machine, taking 1/4 inch seam allowance and back tacking at the start and the finish. Fold over the binding to the wrong side and make sure it just passes the stitching from the seam by a little bit, and then pin or clip in place. I find clips best for this. When you reach the corner, fold the side that you're on all the way over past the corner, press it down and then fold it back over, and it should look something like this. Put a pin or clip in it. Continue to clip or pin your binding all the way around your quilt, making sure that when you fold it over it goes just past that original seam line from where you attached it to the quilt. When it's all turned over and clipped or pinned into place, you can start hand stitching. So thread, then notch your needle and you're ready to go. Start sewing on your quilt just under your binding so that your knot will not be seen, and then carry on stitching by taking a small amount of the quilt just under your binding, and then take a small amount of your binding and pull your thread tight, and keep going until you get back to where you started, notch your thread, and your quilt is finished.
Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, could you please like and subscribe to help me grow my channel? Thank you, and I'll see you next time.